Without us realizing, indebtedness has become an ingrained practice among Malaysians. The proof is, in September 2008, the value of credit card loans in Malaysia was 23.8 billion ringgit Malaysia. This demonstrates how common indebtedness is among Malaysians. However, the question is whether Islam approve or disapprove of this practice. The answer is that Islam strongly discourages its people from incurring debt, especially for the sake of luxury, because Islam places a high value on moderation. On the other hand, Islam allows this practice with the aim of helping people who are in distress, especially in financial. Therefore, this does not mean that we cannot practice this debt cancellation at all. It is critical for us to understand that Islam has its own perspective on the practice of indebtedness. In this video, we will discuss the Islamic perspective on debt in 4 sections: obligation to pay debt, how does the debt cancellation process work in Islam, and debt's pros and cons from the Islamic perspective.
Although we are permitted to incur debt, it is not recommended in our religion. As a result, Islam wants Muslims to stay out of debt unless absolutely necessary. Thus, if we are desperate, we will incur and determine to pay off the debt as quickly as possible. It is not random indebtedness, but is usually delayed and occasionally fails to settle until it generates disagreement and hostility. It is the debtor duty to pay debt as agreed between lender and borrower. As a result, if the borrower fails to pay off his obligation, he will not only face troubles in the world, but he will also face misfortune and anguish in the hereafter if he dies before paying off his debt, and his successors are not obligated to satisfy all debt. Indeed, the deceased will still be in debt, as all of his good action and prizes will be taken away and used to pay off his obligation on the day of the judgment. If it isn't enough, the lender wrongdoing will be transferred to the debtor. Rasulullah SAW stated, as narrated by Ibn Umar, whoever dies or win a dinar or a dirham, it will be paid of his good deed, because then there will be no dinar or dirham.
Okay, how the process of debt transition in Islam? Debt is one type of economy that is developed and applied in society. In the Islamic concept, debt like ta'awun. Debt is a muamalah that is allowed in Islam runs according to the principle of Sharia, named avoiding fraud and action that are forbidden by Allah. This arrangement a recommendation that every debt and receivable transaction be made in writing. The terms and conditions that must be met are as follows. The first is sigat, the second the contract by two parties, the last is asset out. Meanwhile, the condition for creditor or debtors are: the first is balik, the second irreasonable debt and receivable not by sleeping or crazy, the last in the debt and receivable will be cancelled if it is done by a person who is under protection. Debt is a common thing in life as well as in Islamic teaching. This is sunnatullah that has been outlined by Allah, but there are requirements and ethics. The principle of debt that must be considered are: the first, it must be realized that debt is the last alternative when all effort to obtain funds legally and cash are deadlocked. The second, accounts payable are confirmed by the statement like by writing and stamp paper. The third, if you are forced into the debt, do not owe beyond your ability. The last, if a debt has been incurred, there must be an intention to repay it, must have a commitment to repay the debt. Delaying paying the debt for this return effort is injustice, so it is personal to humiliate him.
The advantages of debt from Islamic perspective is fair distribution of wealth. This is because Islamic banking has a strong policy of profit loss sharing principle, meaning that the profit or loss that the bank receives will also be distributed among the bank and the customer. This principle will create an equitable share of wealth because the principle is fair for all parties. Secondly, the advantages of debt is that debt is a must if we lack necessary resources. The point is regard to the general benefit that you can gain from debt, and it is one of the obvious reasons why debt is an acceptable method to help you financially in Islam. A person who is under necessities and need help from others who are more financially stable at that time are permitted to ask for a personal loan from other people that are capable of doing so. Thirdly, debt can help a society to be more financially manageable. This is because offering and receiving debt is a form of transaction that requires detailed documentation of the pillars of the contract. This due to debt is a temporary contract that happens between the debtor and the lender, and this contract requires detailed prescription on how debt is being established, the amount of debt that is handed out, and the person who you ask for debt. All in all, Islamic understanding has taught us that debt is a medium for people who are in dire need of help for basic necessities and not for the purpose of accumulating wealth. Being in debt is not an encouraging state in Islam, but if it is necessary, Islam never forbid his follower to do so.
Debt is considered as something that each of us needs to be aware of. it could be a great danger for us. According to one of the articles that I have read on the impact of having debt, I learned that one of the main causes of poverty would be debt. The more debt incurred, then someone will be closer and closer to poverty. Next, the article also mentioned that debt has become a huge threat to people who carry heavy debt, as they would always become worried about their life if they could not afford to repay the creditors on time. Thus, I start to realize that debt could bring stress to people who have zero money, and this stress might eventually lead someone to negatively impact psychological well-being. In addition, debt could also cause huge humiliation to someone, as they would be embarrassed whenever they meet with a lender. Most probably, the debtors would easily make a promise to pay it, but then they break it, as they just want to prevent themselves from being humiliated at the moment. And if they realize that they could not repay it, they would make the promise again like there is no end. This kind of attitude or behavior would lead them to think that it is tolerable to make a promise and then break it. Following this, I become aware on the effect of having debt to people, which would form countless parental problems to couple, especially the aspect of increasing stress, conflicts, and pressure between them, as they could not fulfill their needs and satisfy their desires due to not having enough money. The worst situation which could occur between the couples is getting divorced, as they might think that this is the best solution that they could take rather than being in heavy debt.
To summarize, Islam is a complete religion because it has provided all the principles that its true believers must follow, particularly those concerning that. We can conclude that Islam is a religion that does not restrict its believer, but rather one that is simple and rational in its decision making. Based on the previous points, it has been proven to bring good and bad to ourselves. Therefore, we as wise Muslims must be wise in taking action in that transactions in order to use this alternative as best as possible. This is to keep us from abusing the practice of that to the point of self-destruction. The choice is in your hands. So that's all from us. Thank you. Assalamualaikum.